My name is Arwen with Advanced Benefits, and I'm very excited to present to you today the importance of benchmarking with an emphasis on your employee benefits package. I am very excited to share this information with you today, and I think it will be very helpful, very valuable to your business. And really what we're going to go over today is benchmarking as a formula in your organization that you can really apply to any aspect of your organization. But because we are employee benefits specialists, we're going to have an emphasis on employee benefits and how you can apply that formula to your employee benefits package. What I also want to share is that a lot of the information that we're going to talk about in today's presentation was taken from a lot of inspiration that I got after I finished reading this book called How Charts Lie How Charts Lie, Getting Smarter About Visual Information by Alberto Cairo. So at the end of today's webinar, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to be giving away a copy of one of these books so that you can also learn how to make sure that you are getting smarter about visual information as well. So make sure you stay through to the end to be eligible to be entered into the drawing. All right. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. Again, I'm Arwen with Advanced Benefits. I am the Director of Marketing here at AB. I've been with the organization for over 9 years now, which I think is crazy. And I head up our benchmarking efforts here at Advanced. So for the last several years, we've been conducting a number of surveys and studies in the Idaho area for Northern Idaho, Southern Idaho, and then this year we'll be doing a State of Idaho report for employee benefits and different aspects of human resources, talent acquisition, and the like. So I've been doing this for a number of years, and I've learned a few things along the way. So I'm very excited to share what I've learned with you here today. So a little bit of an agenda. Today we're going to review how data points can be illustrated and manipulated. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with visual information, which means that it's also very easy to manipulate visual information to tell a specific story. Really, data can tell you anything if you massage it enough. And so we're going to learn today about how we can spot that if that has occurred. We're also going to learn how to identify key points for benchmarking our data. For today's example, we are going to be looking at the employee benefits package. We're also going to learn about how we can interpret that benchmarking data and how we track our return on our investment, which is, as we're going to see, is very tricky to do. So first things first, a little bit back to basics, is when we're talking about reading and digesting visual information, a chart is basically two main things. The first aspect of a chart is going to be your scaffolding. This is all of the information that goes around your chart. This is going to be any text, words. This is going to be any kind of indicators as to what it is that you're looking at. So in my example here, I can see that I have the scaffolding here is the likelihood of having an accident inside your house with a range of 0% to 100%. And we're looking at kittens, puppies, and babies. So this is our scaffolding. And then we have our content, the actual shapes or colors or masses that indicate how much of something there is or a trend of something. And so this is but again, content just by itself, this doesn't tell us anything in the same way that scaffolding just by itself doesn't tell us anything. We need the combination of the two, which gives us our complete chart. So in this example, we can see this made up example that we have a 100% chance of babies having an accident inside of your house compared to puppies and kittens. So this is going to be really what we're looking at, and we're going to learn more about how we're digesting this information. For the charts themselves, for those of you that have taken business statistics, this is going to be a bit of a refresher. But if you're like a lot of entrepreneurs I know that started your business right out of elementary school, there's multiple ways that you can visually graph information. And really, you can take almost the same data set and translate it into all these different visual methods of encoding, but one is going to likely be more helpful than the other. So we can see here that we have things like scatter plots, line charts, bar graphs, horizontal and vertical, and pie charts. And so if, as you're digesting encoded information, it's very helpful to, first of all, identify, okay, what is this that I'm looking at and what is telling me? So for example, like a pie chart, we need to know this is going to add up to 100%, whereas an XY scatter plot, we need to better understand what data is on an x-axis and what data is on a y-axis. So there's 5 helpful, I would say, basic steps to interpreting visual data. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to go through those 5 steps here together. So then that way we can make sure that we have a good system in place for digesting this visual information. So the first step is we're looking at our titles, our introductions, our captions, and most importantly, our source. Where is this data coming from? We're next going to look at our measurements, our units, our scales, and our legends, right? So not only do we know, okay, I know what I'm about to see, I know who it's from, I also know now what the units of measurement are. The next thing you're going to look at is the methods of visual encoding, right? Are they using a pie chart, a line, etc.? And then you're looking at the annotations, right? What additional context are you being provided with? And then the last thing that step is to take a bird's eye view to spot patterns, trends, and relationships. What I think is really interesting is that when we look at visual information currently and we're skimming it, we almost do this entirely backwards, right? We look at the patterns first, and then we start to read, and then we go all the way backwards to where is this even coming from? And you really want to do those in the opposite order in order to fully digest that information. So an example I have here is this is a report that was put up by Gallup. Gallup is what I would consider to be a highly credible resource for getting graphics and visual information. They do a really, really great job of providing details on how the information was collected and giving you access to the raw source data. So here we have a 2022 Gallup report where they asked different Americans, the survey respondents, within the last 12 months, have you or your family or a member of your family put off any sort of medical treatment because of the cost you would have to pay? That is the question that they asked. And this is the results of that question, of that survey. So the first thing we're going to do, step 1, title, introduction, or caption, right? So now we know, okay, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at between 2001 and 2022, how many people put off medical treatment. And then we also know our source, which is Gallup. The next thing we're looking at is our measurements, our units, scales, and our legends. And so we've got that little circled here that we know that on that bottom axis, we have dates starting in 2001 all the way to 2022. So that is our time span. On the other axis, we have the percent. We see here the legend, that green line they're saying is the percent of respondents that responded yes. And then we can see 0 to 50 is the percentage of people responding yes. I'll talk about this in just a little bit, but I think it's very important, and it's a huge green flag for Gallup, the fact that our axis starts at 0. And I'm going to show you in just a little bit of what happens if your axis does not start at 0. And it is a very easy way to manipulate information. So anytime you see an axis starting with 0, so we see here 0, 10, 20, 30, etc., we know that that is a good sign that this data is less likely to have been manipulated. And then our methods of visual encoding. These are, is this a pie chart? Is this a scatter plot? What is this? This is a line graph. So we know that from left to right, we're looking at a period of time. From up to down, we're looking at increases in responses of yes. So now we know, okay, this is what that line shape is telling us. And then those annotations, right? We want to make sure that we're fully understanding, okay, how did we arrive to this information? And that annotation provides us with exactly what question they asked survey respondents that determined whether or not they gave a yes or a no answer. So now I have some additional context in my head. Okay, how did this data even come about? And then lastly, we have that bird's eye view to spot trends, patterns, and relationships. And so we see here that dip and that spike back between 2001 and about 2002, 2003. We see that dip and the flattening out around 2020, which we know we can probably account for, and then a huge spike following 2021 and in 2022. So when we put all of this information together, we followed these 5 steps to digesting this visual information. Now we are equipped fully to start making some assessments. So what conclusions do we draw from this information? Well, number one is we know that the percentage of Americans reporting that they or a family member postponed medical treatment in 2022 rose 12 points in 1 year. So we saw that big spike happen in 2022, which marks the sharpest year-over-year increase to date. So we know, looking at this information, that something's happening here that is out of the ordinary. And then we can also reasonably assess that given current events, right? We saw that dip in that plateau down in 2022 or 2020. We can reasonably assume that that was heavily influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we see those jump back up, we can reasonably assume that these are people that put off services before and during the pandemic, or that are concerned due to rising like inflation. Maybe they've been recently laid off with all these tech layoffs happening. And so we can also take some current events into consideration as to what possibly contributed to this change, okay? But, and you might say, oh, well, that's that. That's all the information I need to know based off of this graph. But I think it's very important in any aspect of benchmarking is you always want to ask yourself, are those conclusions correct? And am I missing any data? So you're going to encounter this a lot in your business where you are presented with some high level or a few data points, and you might be inclined to make some assessments or business decisions just based off of that data alone. But you could be drawing the most, or you could be drawing incorrect conclusions or too hasty of conclusions without gathering additional information. So what else are you missing? Well, that same report also broke out this information by demographics. And so we can see that if we look at income levels, for example, maybe in your organization, you have a large employee population that is entry-level workers that are making minimum wage or close to minimum wage, or what you consider entry-level wage, right? Maybe you are, more of like a white-collar work environment where you're going to have more mid-level team members, maybe some higher trained staff that you might consider middle income. Or maybe your organization, is a very, what you consider like a high-end organization, or you have a lot of high-income earners, that are going to take that. You're going to want to take all that information into consideration. And so with this, we can see that in this example, that your lower income, kind of no surprise there, population was more likely to have put off medical care than your higher income earners. And so if you were to make a decision just based off of the previous graph, but you have a significantly high upper income population, well, maybe that decision isn't as a good representation of your population. Maybe your population, if we look at ages, right? Maybe you have a significant portion of younger individuals. Maybe you have a significant portion of middle-aged or close to retirement, or even retirees. So we can see here that, again, this data tells us a different story. It slices and dices the data and gives us more context. So if I have a population of very young employees, I might draw different conclusions through looking at some benchmarking data than I might if I were to have a population of older, an older average age, for example. We also know that gender differences can play a huge part in, demographics and in, making decisions. And so if you have an employee population that is more male than female, or vice versa, then your business decisions might look different based off of the benchmarking information that you receive versus if you hadn't seen it at all. So again, we can see in this example that women were more likely to delay medical treatment. And so if you're in all this to say that if you're an employer who has a significant amount of upper income men who are younger, you may be less inclined to say, hey, there's a huge problem here because those are the lower trending population, versus if you have a number of female employees that are entry-level income that are closer to retirement age. The outcomes of your decision could be wildly different from each other based off of that information. So it's important to always, whenever you can, seek additional context and data to ensure that you're drawing the correct conclusions. The next thing we're going to look at here is don't be misled. Visual information, especially if you're a skimmer and you're not following those 5 key steps to understanding and breaking down that graphical information, then it's very easy to be bamboozled. So I have a couple examples here. So an example we have of a pie chart from Fox News about the 2012 presidential run. We have a pie chart here that 70% back Palin and 60% back Romney and 63% back Huckabee. And the last time I checked, pie charts add up to 100%. And so this is a pie chart that is misrepresenting respondent data. Earlier, I mentioned that access being at a 0 point, and that's very important because this is an example of a graph that makes it look like welfare is spiraling out of control. But what you'll note is that the y-axis starts not at 0, but at 94 million. So by manipulating where your y-axis starts on your graph will heavily influence the size of the subsequent graphs for your content. And so when you are looking at this kind of information, this manipulation means that it looks like that it's spiraling out of control. When if you were to set your y-axis at 0, you would see a more true picture of that, some sort of federal individuals that are receiving some sort of federal welfare is increasing on a much more smaller or a smaller rate than this makes it look to be. It's also important to take into consideration that information can just be wrong. So here's another example of Fox News of a 2011 report. And you'll notice on the far right-hand side, you see October unemployment rate at 9%, and you see November at 8.6%. However, they're on the same rate. And so you can see here, and if you look at September, there's a huge difference between 9.1 and 9.0, and it doesn't look good if they're trying to tell a certain story if 8.6 suddenly shoots down. So it's very important to keep into consideration that even though this information might be illustrated, that it could just be completely illustrated incorrectly. So make sure you're always taking a second look and scrutinizing the information that you're seeing. This is a really, really tricky one. And I think that this is something that we don't see too often, but if we do, that it's good to be aware of. So this particular graph shows job and health insurance losses accelerating. Right. So this is trying to tell us, it's saying, hey, this is happening at a high rate. They're taking a stance here. And so what they've done is they've manipulated the data to make it look like uninsured Americans and the unemployment rate is happening at about the same pace. But what you'll notice is that there are 2 y-axes. You have uninsured Americans over here illustrated in the millions, and you have the unemployment rate over here illustrated in percentages. It's very, very clever. But if you were to pull this information apart, right, 2 y-axes don't necessarily belong on the same chart. If you pull this information apart into 2 separate charts, what you'll learn is that a lack of insurance is increased only very slightly from 15% to 16%, whereas the unemployment rate is increasing more rapidly from 4.5% to 7.5%. But by putting it on this graph at the same, with two y-axes, they're able to manipulate this data to make it look as if there is a correspondence there. So to recap, when we're going through our charts and understanding our visual information, make sure you're following those 5 steps to analyzing the elements of a chart. When you are making business decisions, if you're benchmarking any aspect of your business, whether it's marketing or sales or employee benefits, you want to make sure that you're taking demographics into consideration. If you're able to drill down into that next layer of data above just an aggregate level, you might uncover certain trends that would tell you a different story or would lead you to draw different conclusions than what that initial data might tell you. Don't be fooled by misleading graphs. They are out there, and it's up to us sometimes to find them and to hold the creators accountable. And then you want to look for red flag indicators, right? We saw things like the y-axis not set to 0 or set to a higher rate. Another red flag indicator could be a lack of source. So if they fail to provide a source for the data, that's another red flag. Or if the data is very, very old, that can also be a red flag. Whereas a green flag is going to be something like, I know what the source is, I can easily find the source. Or in Gallup's case, the raw data, their actual spreadsheet, is typically available to download if you want to assess the raw data to see how they drew those conclusions. So, there are indicators that can tell you at a higher level, hey, this might be trustworthy, this might not be. So with that, when the next step of benchmarking anything in our organization is going to be to ask ourselves, okay, we've gathered this information, now it's time to make some assessments and compare ourselves against this data. What purpose does that, whatever it is, marketing, sales, HR, initiatives, employee benefits, what purpose does that serve in your organization? And what are your goals? So if you don't know what the purpose of that aspect of your business is, or what your intended goals are, it can be very difficult, I would say nearly impossible, to make decisions one way or the other, because you don't know if those decisions are going to draw you closer or further away from those goals and those desired outcomes. So in the case of the employee benefits package, maybe the purpose of our benefits package is to attract talent for recruitment purposes. Maybe it's to retain talent by having really rich benefits that lead them to want to stay with us. Maybe it's to have healthy and happy employees so they have higher levels of productivity, right? These are all things that could be purposes in our organization, or our goals is to have happier, more productive employees, or to have a lower turnover rate, things like that. Another thing that's really important when you are assessing benchmarking data is keeping different viewpoints in mind, or different perspectives. And so an example of this is that in our 2022 Magnify Benefits benchmark report that we did, surveying employers in Idaho on their benefits package, we asked employers, which would you consider must-haves versus nice-to-haves in your benefits package? So things ranging from health to dental to life to disability, all of those things. And we got some pretty great responses, just very insightful responses on what would be considered must-haves versus nice-to-haves. But if you were to ask that same question to employees, you're going to get much different answers. And so in the same way here, we've got all that same question being answered by the 4 different main generations that we find in our workforce. And if, again, back to that level of what's the next level down as far as being more specific. If I'm an organization that has a much larger population of Gen X versus Gen Z, for example, I might make some much different decisions about my benefits package with those additional perspectives in mind. If I were just to take the employer perspectives and I'm saying, okay, well, every other employers think that this is really important. Well, what's actually important to my employees, right? So if one of your goals is for happier, healthier, more productive employees, don't forget to take employees' perspectives into consideration. And the same formula applies if it's marketing or sales. Don't just look for your own perspective, look for the perspectives of your clients, your intended audience, your consumers, whatever it is. If you're recruiting, it's your candidates. This formula can apply to all aspects of your business when it comes to benchmarking and making these assessments. The next step we want to do is we want to identify what data points are measurable. There's a lot of data that we could assess and that we could try to get information for. Some of that data is very abstract. It's a lot of I think, I feel. And then there is data out there that is tangible, it's quantifiable, it's measurable. So when you're going to sit down and say, I want to benchmark this, right? I want to benchmark my clicks in my marketing team, or my average click-through ratio, or whatever that is, or in our benefits package, I want to measure this. You're looking for what are your tangible, measurable items. So in our benefits package, for example, we've got 4 main items. We can benchmark our premium contribution model, which is going to be the how much your employees are paying for your benefits, how much the company is paying for benefits. It's a very tangible, measurable number to assess. It also is going to indicate your total compensation package for your employees, as opposed to your benefit design. Your benefit design is going to be how rich is your benefits package, right? What kind of potential barriers to care exist for your employees that are trying to access services? Are they facing really high deductibles if they want to access services? Or, is it more accessible with lower deductibles, that sort of thing? And then your benefit offerings, right? We saw on the previous slide the different generations and what they thought different, benefits were must-haves versus nice-to-haves. So if you're going to measure what benefits are offered, that's where that demographic information is going to come in really, really handy. And then, of course, your return on investment, especially if you are or work under a CFO. This is the numbers talk. Show me where this, helped our business. And so arguably the hardest piece to pin down, but there are measurables out there that we're going to talk about. Another important aspect of benchmarking is you need to understand historical context, right? So for example, I would say in marketing, for example, if you were an organization that did a lot of, but back before the internet, a lot of mailers or a lot of cold calling, right? That things have changed significantly since the age of the internet and now, social media and influencers and content creators, right? And so decisions, the kind of decisions you're going to make are going to change considerably. And so if you understand your historical perspective or historical context, that is going to allow you to make better decisions. An example here we have, this is from the Kaiser Family Foundation's annual employer-sponsored health benefits study that they do. This shows us the average cost, the average employee premium for employee only, which is that blue line, and employee plus family, all the way back to 1999. So if you're working with an individual who maybe they really haven't paid attention to the cost of benefits since the early 2000s, and they're able to see this information, they're going to have a much better perspective on, okay, what's actually reasonable, what's actually the true situation, the true picture now. It's essentially how do you shake off the potential cobwebs from somebody of what they think something should be because that's what it was, that's what it used to be, or it's the reality check. The reality is that employee plus family coverage no longer costs $129, right? So always seek historical perspective whenever possible. So on that premium contribution model, another aspect of benchmarking is what actually applies to my situation, right? Your business is unique. There are no two businesses that are exactly the same, franchises excluded, right? Just like the entire business. It's as unique as a fingerprint. And so just because you receive benchmarking data that fits one model does not necessarily mean it's going to fit another. So an example I have here is we have the average traditional PPO gross rates with dollar amounts broken out by what the employer contributes in blue versus what the employee contributes in orange. And so if you were an employer who's trying to decide, hey, how much should my employees pay for their insurance on a traditional plan versus how much should I pay, this would be very helpful for you if your rates were based off of enrollment, right? If your rates are based off of, am I enrolling just by myself? Am I enrolling with a spouse or a child, right? Those are called composite rates, rates that are based off of the enrollment level, not their age. If I am an employer who has age rates, where my rates are based off of how old an employee is, this information does not help me, right? If I know, oh, I should be paying $489 for an employee, like this graph is telling me, but a 20-year-old only costs me $300 and a 64-year-old costs me $800, that doesn't translate well. So this information, that situation, someone's going to look at this and say, this doesn't help me, right? So it's important to make sure that just one data set does not fit all, which is why you want to seek out additional data sets for what applies to your situation. So in this data set, we have the average gross rates with percentage based off of employer contribution and employee contribution. Now, this is a blending of both traditional and high deductible health plans from our Magnified 2022 benchmark report and the Kaiser Family Foundation benchmark report as well. This is going to be more helpful. If I am an employer that has rates that are based off of age, this is more meaningful to me because now I know that, hey, kind of regardless of what age, someone is, for me to be competitive in my market, I know that I need to be paying at least 80% of an employee's premium. Or if I want to beat the national benchmark, I want to contribute at least 83% of an employee's premium. So we can see that we have data that on the surface, we would say, oh, this kind of tells us the same thing, but it couldn't be any farther, different as far as the application of that data. So just important to remember that one size does not fit all when it comes to benchmarking data. Another thing to remember is that sometimes there's more information that you need in order to read between the lines, right? And so on paper, you might be an employer and you might benchmark your high deductible health plan, let's pretend. And you say, oh my gosh, I'm only paying 70% of my employees' premium. So on paper, you look much less competitive than the regional or the national average. But what if you're an employer who is, maybe you're contributing to somebody's health savings account? And so that next level of information, that deeper level of information is going to paint a more full picture of, yes, maybe you're only contributing 70% of an employee's premium, but maybe you're part of the 44% that are contributing to an employee's health savings account. Maybe you're part of the 29% nationally that is front loading that account and putting money in at the first of the year, every year. Or maybe you're part of the 39% that contribute every pay period. But those are things that need to be taken into consideration, where on paper you may look less competitive, but with that next level down of information, that additional context, that is going to illuminate a more full picture. It's also important to keep in mind, and I'm going to touch really briefly on this, the differences between average and median. Again, we know from even just our basic math or statistics class that if I were to, in some situations, averages make sense. If all the data points are relatively close together, averages could be a good representation. But in the case of HSA employer contributions, averages are not necessarily a good fit when it comes to how much employers, the benchmark for how much employers are contributing. The reason for this is we have outliers. Anytime you have outliers, you have somebody that's contributing zero, you have somebody that's contributing thousands of dollars. That's going to really mess up your averages. And so anytime you're benchmarking anything, if something is illustrated with an average, a smart question to ask the data source is, were there outliers, and were the outliers removed, or are they included in this data set? Because if your outliers are removed, that's going to change that average number very quickly. And in this instance, that's where the median made more sense, right? If I were to line up 100 employers in a room and ask each of them, how much do you contribute to an HSA bank account? And I were to organize them from lowest to highest, I want to know employer number 50. What are you offering, right? What's that middle of the road? And so in that situation, that's where we, for the 2022 Magnified Benefits Benchmark Report, we went with a median so that we could better represent what was true to an average employer. And it was broken out by company size, right? Just because, excuse me, if you're an employer that has 500 or more employees, it may be significantly more feasible for you to contribute to an HSA bank account as opposed to an employer with 1 to 49 employees. And so that's why, and another example of when you're benchmarking your data, you want to look for that next level down of, did the did this report take those things into consideration, like company size? And did they take outliers into consideration? And the answer for this particular graph and data set is yes to both of those answers or questions. Okay, next we're going to talk about benefit design. So benefit design being, how rich is my benefits package as far as deductibles, co-pays, out-of-pocket maximums, right? If I want to know how good my benefits are compared to my competitors, that's what I'm looking for. And so here we can see the average medical deductible and out-of-pocket maximum for our region, for Idaho, compared to our national data. Now, I think that something that's really important to call out is a good benchmark, a good report that gives you good data is going to call out any caveats, right? It's very easy to just sweep it something under the rug, or, oh, no one's going to look that closely. And so it's really important. Again, we're looking for those green flags. A green flag is somebody that calls out something. They're going to call out any kind of caveat or nuances. So we can see here in this particular report that we have an asterisk next to the individual out-of-pocket maximum for our national data. And that disclaimer tells us that the national individual out-of-pocket maximum is a blended average of all plan types. And so we know for the region, we're looking only at traditional PPO. And for the out-of-pocket maximum national number, we're looking at all plan types. And so that's important to take into consideration. You're looking for those green flags of, hey, there's a nuance here. This isn't necessarily apples to apples. But you have to ask yourself, the data is still helpful. I still want the data. I would rather have the data knowing the nuance than not have it at all, because at least I have something to work with. So again, looking for those green flags is look for, if you see an asterisk and they explain why there's a nuance, that's a green flag. And then similar here, we have, same thing for average deductibles and out-of-pocket maximums for a high deductible health plan. And so if I'm an employer who is considering, hey, I want to have a good benefits package, I might take this information and make some decisions based off of, well, I want to have better than the, average regional deductible. So I'm going to choose an HSA, a high deductible health plan with less than a $3,175 deductible, or less than a $6,300 deductible for families. And so this is the kind of data that is designed to allow you to make decisions based off of data instead of gut reactions, right? We have a lot of gut instincts like, well, I think that this is good and I think this is competitive. But do you really, really know, right? So this is the kind of information that you want to get your hands on to be able to make informed and educated decisions. And then speaking to benefit offerings, right? And so back to that graph where we're looking at, okay, how many, what benefits are considered nice to haves versus must haves, right? What is the breadth of benefits that you offer? So when it comes to, again, that next level of data down, if we were just to say, oh, average benefit offerings is blah, 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 that could be helpful, but we're taking into consideration, well, if you're a very, very large company, it's much easier to offer multiple benefits. Whereas if you're a smaller organization, if you have maybe 10 employees, then that there are things like participation requirements, a minimum amount of employees that must enroll in that benefit in order for the benefit to even be launched. And that's something that small companies struggle with, is getting enough people to sign up to actually offer that benefit. It's not something that it's not a struggle large employers face necessarily. And so that's why that next level of data down is, am I offering the data drilled down to a company size so that I can make a decision based off of my company's specifics versus just trying to make some kind of decision with this huge aggregate number in mind. That's not helpful to me. And then there's also your benefit offerings that are a little bit more abstract. And so you're going to see, similar to the Gallup report, where you saw that big spike in 2022 of Americans that put off healthcare due to cost concerns, you're going to see spikes. You are an employer that works in the world, and you are not immune to current events. And so you're going to see some changes that are going to occur, not as a result of just cold benchmarking data, but as a result of quickly changing the quickly changing employer landscape. So an example of that is Kaiser Family Foundation's 2021 report reported that 31% of employers with more than 50 employees significantly expanded their resources for their employees for things like mental health, substance abuse services, telemedicine. And so we saw a huge spike after the pandemic of a big, 17% jump in employers offering employee assistance programs and a 19% jump in employers were offering employees a work from home or a remote work environment. These are really big spikes that, if they're on a visual graph or visual information or a line graph rather, those big spikes that you're not necessarily going to look at benchmarking data and say, oh, we need to offer this, but you may look at the current events in the employer landscape, and you may still make decisions based off of that current circumstance. But in arrears, you're able to look back and see, hey, now that we've made this decision to offer EAP, how did we stack up? And you might be one of that 17% of employers that chose to offer EAP, whereas before you did not. So to recap, when we're looking at benchmarking our data, it's important to identify the appropriate data points that are measurable. There's a lot of data points out there, and you have to narrow it down to, what specifically do I want to know? You need to make sure that you have historical context. You need to understand where you're going. You need to understand where you've been. So seeking that historical context is going to be really valuable for you to make a decision with the full perspective in mind. Does the data translate to your situation? Again, back to that reference of, if I'm an age-rated employer, then telling me a flat dollar amount isn't helpful to me compared to a percentage, right? You want to make sure that you're benchmarking based off of what applies to your situation. Always, always, always seek more information whenever possible. Is there other data sets that give you a better, more full picture, such as if employers are contributing to HSA bank accounts, that adds to the picture of what you are, paying for your employees? And is this data even applicable to you, right? We saw earlier that a large employer offers significantly more benefits than a small employer. Make sure you're not falling in the trap of comparing yourself to an organization that is outside of what you would consider to be impactful to your data set. What is actually feasible for me as an employer? What translates to me and my employees? But the most tricky aspect of it, how do we measure return on investment, right? This is where we have our sheets and our balance sheets and our CFOs going, okay, you want me to spend money by increasing our contribution to employees' benefits. You want us to start putting money into HSA bank accounts. That costs money. What am I getting for that? And ROI has always been really difficult to track, but I'm going to give you some best practices for being able to track ROI anytime you're trying to make a decision based off of benchmarking data. So we're going to talk about how we measure these outcomes. We're going to talk about be aware of correlation versus causation, making sure you're keeping your original goal in mind. What kind of business KPIs are already in place that you can leverage, and how do you prove a negative? So this is one of my favorite graphs I love. So be aware of correlation and causation. This graph illustrates the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool from 1999 to 2009 compared to the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in. Looks awfully similar. I think we have, if I were to look at this graph, I feel like Nicolas Cage would have some explaining to do to the families of these pool drowning victims. So it's, as we saw earlier in the, section where we talked about don't be misled, it is so easy to fall into the trap of measuring data and seeing, oh, this changed, it must have been this, right? And I'm going to use, again, back to these formulas that I'm talking about can apply to, all aspects of your business. And so if we're talking about sales, perhaps you might be tempted to say, okay, a benchmark tells us that we need to be posting on social media at least once a day. That's what the benchmark data tells us. So our marketing team starts posting once a day, and then suddenly we see a bunch of sales come through. And we can see a graph of the number of posts, that are consistently happening and the number of sales. We might go, oh, that's it. It worked. But we know there might be outside factors. Did the CEO recently appear on some kind of broadcast or publication? Was there, did something change in your environment to where consumers suddenly needed or desired your product? If you were a toilet paper manufacturer before the pandemic, like right as the pandemic hit, if you were posting every day on social media and suddenly TP is flying off the shelves, you could make the argument that your social media posts directly caused your toilet paper sales to rise, when we know that a complete outside factor was in fact to blame. And so just be mindful of anytime you start to see these trend lines overlap, that it's important to remember this graph, that is not always the case, right? And so when we're looking at this information, I think what's more helpful is to keep your original goals in mind, right? Did this bring us closer or further from our goals? So here we have an example. This is a made-up graph with made-up data. But we have here average plan deductibles on our x-axis and average claims spend on our y-axis. So let's pretend if you're an employer who's self-funded, right? You are responsible for paying the claims. Maybe your goal is to have, to decrease your claims spend, right? And we know in the industry, and this is something that, we can document and we can share, through tons of experience and through, time telling us that this is how this works, is the higher an employee or a member's deductible is, the less likely they are to seek care or to use those benefits because of that barrier of I have to pay 100% of my medical bills up to my deductible. And so the higher their deductible is, they know they're paying for it. So they might think twice about whether or not they really need that particular service. Whereas somebody that has a lower deductible, maybe I have a $500 deductible, I can meet that easy peasy, and you've just given me a blank checkbook or a credit card with no limit that I can go and get all of these services done. So this graph, we can see a higher claim spend, the lower the deductible, and a lower claims spend, the higher the deductible. It's an inverse relationship. And anytime you're looking at a graph and you can see this trend line here, we have this kind of like lower scooping trend line, then we can know that, hey, anytime you can see a trend line, that's where you can go, okay, this is something that we actually have something here. versus if you were to see a scatter plot where it's all over the place and there's no rhyme or reason, there's no trend line, then maybe that has less of a direct correlation than one would think, right? So look for trend lines. So if your original goal, again, back to the original goal, was to decrease your claim spend, congratulations. Now you know what decisions to make or what decisions to possibly make to influence that. But if your goal was to keep your employees happy and healthy and out of the emergency room, you might have an opposite approach. So here we have the average plan deductible mapped out, connected as opposed to annual emergency room occurrences. Again, back to that point, if I have a higher deductible and I'm on the hook for 100% of my medical bills, I am less likely to seek care for preventive or maintenance services or things that I might be able to catch earlier before they turn into a big deal. I'm more likely to just suck it up and power through and make it work until I end up in the ER. And so we can see here, similarly, I also have a trend line that I can follow here to say, oh man, the higher my deductible is, the more often my employees, there's an annual ER occurrence. And so if your goal was to keep your employees happy and healthy and decrease claims spend, then you're going, well, these are this is Scoopy, you still have a trend line, this little Scoopy line here, but it is in the complete opposite direction from the previous graph. And so what this tells you is if you were to look at this data together, there's a sweet spot somewhere in here of having a higher deductible, lower ER occurrences, and lower claims spend. And so if my goal was to keep my employees happy and healthy and reduce claim spend, I'm going to need to pull that information together and make an informed and educated decision based off of all data points, not just one. Another aspect of ROI is, there's a best practice rather, is what kind of KPI metrics are already out there that you can leverage effectively, that already exist in your business. They're well documented and it's something that you can point to. This is more abstract, right? So if we're looking at presenteeism and absenteeism, right? Or people, we can see productivity and output if you're in like manufacturing. If you're in sales, maybe you're looking at average revenue per employee. If you're in HR or a big focus on employee engagement, you might be looking at employee satisfaction scores. If you are in marketing, maybe you're looking at client net promoter scores. If you're a manager, you might be looking at the number of overtime hours that you're paying out. And if you're an HR or a business owner, you might be looking at the employee turnover rate. These are all KPIs that already exist. There's already loads of information out there on how to track it, on the effects that these have on your business. And so even what I would consider these is to be secondary metrics, where if my employee benefits package goal is to have happy, healthy employees, if I make a change, I can look at these and say, all right, did my productivity increase? Did my employee satisfaction scores go up? And did my employee turnover rate reduce? There might be other outside factors that are influencing all of those KPIs, but if those KPIs trend in a positive direction, it is fair. And you allow yourself to say, yes, I believe that this had an influence on these KPIs. And until those KPIs stop trending in a positive direction, I would say you are empowered to continue making those decisions, but you have to keep your goals in mind. And then lastly, proving a negative. One thing we talk about all the time with our clients is that we really can't prove a negative, right? If you implement a wellness program, right? When wellness programs, they tend to cost money. You either have to pay a vendor to do it, or you have to, buy, you have to pay somebody to administer it, whatever that looks like. It costs money. And if you implement a wellness program, you cannot prove that somebody didn't go to the emergency room because you have a wellness program that that pays everybody to go get their wellness exam. You just cannot prove it. You can't prove that by doing a walking challenge that you turn someone's life around when they were on the brink of obesity or diabetes. I go on and on and on, but there are some things you just can't prove. It's called proving a negative. However, what I fall back on is the testimonials that prove an impact was made. And in order to do that, you have to be engaged with the audience that you are making these changes for. So if I'm benchmarking my employee benefits and I'm making decisions for my employee benefits, my employees are the ones that I want feedback from. In the same way that if I'm benchmarking some kind of sales metric, my clients or my consumers is who I want to be asking this feedback from. So what I wanted to kind of leave with you here are two stories that I have is that we helped one client implement a wellness program that encouraged employees and paid for employees to participate in a wellness visit with their primary care physician. It was a construction group. They had a bunch of employees that hadn't been to the doctor in years. And there was a lot of, well, we don't know if I'm healthy because I haven't seen my doctor in ages. So this one individual went to the doctor and for his wellness exam, because he's like, oh, I'm going to get my $50. Was admitted to the hospital the same day because he had a significant percentage of blockage in his heart that he was a ticking time bomb, basically. He was a heart attack waiting to happen. And so we heard about that story. And so that is an instance where we can point to the wellness program and say, wow, this made a difference. This person would have ended up in the emergency room with a heart attack and it was caught. Was it still expensive? Yes, but he's alive, right? The second story I have is the same thing, a wellness program that an employer put in place where it was a biometric screening. Go participate in the health fair, get your blood drawn and your levels checked out, and you get $50 on your paycheck or something like that. The employee participated because yeah, I'll get a cool $50. Again, cost money to do that. And then that person, the vendor said, hey, you really need to go see your doctor and get a stress test because I think something's going on here. He went in and met with his doctor, and his doctor did put him through a stress test and discovered that he had incredibly high blood pressure that was very, very dangerous for his health. And he was able to get put on a medication that was able to treat his high blood pressure, whereas otherwise, he could have done a significant amount of damage to his body. So allow yourself time to hear those testimonials. Beware of correlation versus causation. Look for trend lines. Ask yourself if you're drawing further or closer away from your goals. Use your existing business KPIs as secondary indicators as to whether or not you are trending in a positive or negative direction, and ask for feedback and input often and consistently from the intended audience to make sure that if you can at all capture proving a negative. And then I would lastly challenge you, when was the last time you benchmarked an aspect of your business? I am going to plug that in the next few months, we are going to be putting together our State of Idaho 2023 report for our employee benefits. So if that's something that you are interested in, if you're wanting to benchmark your benefits, we are going to be doing a full State of Idaho study. So please reach out to us if that's something that you're interested in, and we'll let you know when that window opens up. And I'm going to go ahead and open it up. If there's any questions, you're welcome to put it in the chat and I'd be happy to answer. Again, if you're interested in participating in our 2023 benchmark study for employee benefits, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to assist you. And with that, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.